12,000 men stepped out of a tree line on a July afternoon and walked in broad daylight across 1 mile of open ground directly into the muzzles of massed artillery. They did this on purpose. These were not conscripts stumbling into an ambush. They were veterans of a dozen battles, led by officers who had studied the ground and understood the mathematics of what they were about to attempt. They did it anyway, because Robert E. Lee believed that one concentrated blow at the center of the Union line would crack the Army of the Potomac in half and end the war. Everything converged on a single mile of Pennsylvania farmland: the fate of slavery, the survival of the Confederacy, the future of a republic that was 87 years old and tearing itself apart. And the man whose job it was to give the order to begin was so horrified by what he was about to do that when the moment came, he could not speak. He could not say the word that would send 12,000 men across that mile. So he did something else instead. Something that has haunted the history of this war ever since. By the end of this video, you will know what he did, and you will understand why a dying general's hand on a cannon barrel became the symbol of an entire nation's collapse. 2 days of the bloodiest fighting North America had ever seen had produced no decisive result. On July 1st, Confederate forces drove Union troops back through the streets of Gettysburg in running combat, but the retreating Federals fell back to the high ground south of town: Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, the rocky wooded heights of Little Round Top. They dug in along a fishhook-shaped defensive line, anchored on elevated terrain, and by nightfall, reinforcements were streaming in from every direction. Lee had won the first day, but had failed to seize the ground that mattered. On July 2nd, Lee attacked both ends of the Union line in fighting so savage that the place names became synonyms for slaughter: the Peach Orchard, where Union troops were caught in a salient and slaughtered from 3 directions; the wheat field, where control of 20 acres of farmland changed hands 6 times in a single afternoon, and the wheat was trampled into a paste of mud and blood that no crop would grow in for years; Devil's Den, where sharpshooters fired from behind boulders the size of houses; and Little Round Top, the rocky hill anchoring the southern end of the Union line, where Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, a college professor from Maine who had been teaching rhetoric 2 years earlier, ordered a bayonet charge downhill because his regiment, the 20th Maine, had run out of ammunition and the only options were charge or die where they stood. They charged. They held the hill. If they had not, the entire Union position would have been turned from the flank and the battle would have ended differently. On the northern end, Confederate brigades hurled themselves at Culp's Hill in fighting so close that soldiers could hear each other's voices between volleys. Both attacks came agonizingly close to breaking through. Both failed. The Union line bent under pressure that should have snapped it, but it held. Now dawn on July 3rd found 2 exhausted armies staring at each other across less than a mile of Pennsylvania farmland. The Union line stretched along Cemetery Ridge, a low open spine of ground reinforced with stone walls and packed with artillery. Lee looked at that line and saw what no one else saw: a center that could be broken if hit with enough force at a single point. Longstreet looked at the same line and saw what everyone else saw: a fortress. Lee's plan had 3 parts. First, a massive artillery bombardment to suppress the Union guns and shatter the infantry behind the stone wall. Second, 12,000 infantry would cross the mile of open ground and break through the weakened center. 3rd, J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry would strike the Union rear simultaneously, trapping Meade's army between infantry from the front and cavalry from behind. Hammer and anvil. On paper, the plan was devastating. In practice, every element would fail. Stuart's cavalry rode out to hit the Union rear 3 miles east of the main battlefield. Waiting for him was a 23-year-old brigadier general with golden hair and a relationship with risk that other men would call insanity and he called Tuesday. George Armstrong Custer. His Michigan Cavalry Brigade met Stuart's veterans head-on in a collision of horses and sabers and carbine fire at point-blank range. Horses collided chest to chest and went down screaming in tangled heaps of flesh and leather and iron. Men fought from the saddle and on the ground and in the dust between fallen horses, slashing with sabers at faces they could barely see through the smoke. Custer reportedly shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines," as he personally led a charge directly into Stuart's advance, riding at the head of the column because leading from behind was a concept he had never been introduced to. The clash was ferocious. Stuart was beaten back. The rear attack failed completely, and with it failed the last element of Lee's plan that might have made the infantry assault survivable, because Stuart's cavalry hitting the Union rear would have forced Meade to pull troops from Cemetery Ridge to defend his supply lines. Fewer men behind the wall, fewer guns firing into the approaching formation. A chance, however slim, that the infantry could reach the wall in numbers sufficient to break through. With Stuart blocked, that chance evaporated. The infantry would face the full concentrated fury of every Union gun and every Union rifle on Cemetery Ridge, alone, unsupported. Walking across a mile of open ground with nothing between them and the Muzzles except the courage that Lee was counting on and the math that Longstreet already knew. At 1:07, 2 cannon shots boomed from Seminary Ridge, the signal. Then within seconds the entire Confederate artillery line erupted, over 150 guns firing simultaneously. The sound exceeded anything human experience could prepare a person for. Witnesses miles away described continuous rolling thunder that never paused. The ground trembled beneath the feet of men on both ridges. Windows shattered in the homes of Gettysburg. Civilians hiding in basements, families with children pressed against each other on stone floors, felt the earth buck and heave beneath them while plaster dust rained from ceilings and children screamed into their mothers' laps. For nearly 2 hours, Confederate shells shrieked across the valley and slammed into Cemetery Ridge. The sound was a physical presence. It pressed against the chest. It vibrated in the teeth. Soldiers who survived described the sensation of the ground beneath them shuddering with each detonation, as if the earth itself was trying to shake them loose. Ammunition limbers detonated in fireballs that sent chunks of burning wood and iron spinning through the air for hundreds of yards. Horses were torn apart where they stood in the traces, their screams audible even above the continuous roar of the guns. Some gunners went deaf in the first 10 minutes and continued firing by watching the man beside them for timing, unable to hear their own commands or the orders shouted 5 feet from their ears. Soldiers pressed flat behind the stone wall, faces in the dirt, hands over the backs of their necks, and made whatever bargain with God felt most urgent in the 3 seconds between impacts. But inside the choking gray fog that swallowed the ridgeline, the Confederate gunners were making a catastrophic error. The smoke made it impossible to observe where their shells were landing. The vast majority of the bombardment was sailing over Cemetery Ridge and detonating in the rear areas, destroying supply wagons, killing horses, terrorizing staff officers, but leaving the frontline Union infantry and artillery behind the stone wall largely untouched. The bombardment that was supposed to shatter the defense before the infantry stepped off was missing its target. Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt recognized the opportunity. He ordered his guns to stop firing, not because they were destroyed, because silence from the ridge would convince the Confederates that their bombardment had worked. The guns fell quiet. The smoke hung motionless, and across the valley, Confederate Colonel E. Porter Alexander peered through his glass at the silent ridge and believed what Hunt wanted him to believe. He sent a desperate message to Pickett. "If you are coming at all, come at once or I cannot give you proper support." The ammunition was nearly spent. The moment had arrived. Before the first man stepped from that tree line, there was a moment that has haunted the history of this war ever since. George Pickett, theatrical, perfumed, vibrating with the anticipation of the glory he had craved his entire career, rode to Longstreet and asked the question, "General, shall I advance? This is the moment the cold open promised you, the moment a general could not speak." Longstreet had spent the morning arguing with Lee in a voice that officers nearby said they had never heard from him before. Pleading, not discussing, pleading. He had proposed a flanking movement around the Union left that would have forced Meade to abandon his position without a frontal assault across a mile of open ground into the teeth of massed artillery. Lee refused. The attack would proceed. Longstreet looked at the mile of killing ground. He looked at the stone wall bristling with guns whose crews had not been suppressed and whose ammunition had been conserved by the very silence that Alexander had mistaken for destruction. He looked at the batteries on Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill that would pour enfilade fire into the flanks of any column crossing that valley. He saw what every professional soldier on both sides of the field saw: math. And the math said these men were going to die. Longstreet did the math. Lee did the faith. Now Pickett stood in front of him asking for the word, and James Longstreet, the second highest-ranking officer in the Confederate Army, the man who had never hesitated at Antietam or Fredericksburg or Chickamauga, could not make his mouth form the syllable that would send 12,000 men across that ground. He lowered his chin to his chest. He closed his eyes. He nodded. That was all. A nod. The most reluctant order in American military history, delivered without a single spoken word. Pickett saluted and said, "I shall lead my division forward, sir," and rode back to his men. The order rippled down the line. Forward. March. The charge begins not as a charge, but as a walk. From the tree line on Seminary Ridge, 12,000 men emerge in formation so precise it looks rehearsed. Long-dressed lines stretching nearly a mile from end to end. Battle flags snapping in whatever breeze stirs the superheated air. Officers on horseback at the front of their commands, swords drawn, glinting in the afternoon sun. The alignment is parade ground perfect. From behind the stone wall, Union soldiers rise to their knees and stare. Many have never seen anything like it. An entire assault force in textbook formation walking toward them across open farmland as if on review, as if there were no cannons, as if there were no stone wall, as if the mile between them were a parade ground and not a killing field that every man on both sides of the wall knew it to be. A Union officer later wrote that the sight was the most magnificent and the most terrible thing he had ever witnessed in the same sentence. The precision of the lines, the flutter of battle flags, the glint of bayonets catching the afternoon sun across the full width of the valley, and beneath the beauty, the knowledge that every step those men took brought them closer to the muzzles of guns whose crews were already measuring the range and waiting for the order to fire. The sound is not what you would expect. No rebel yell. Not yet. Just the rhythmic crush of thousands of boots flattening dry wheat stalks, the jingle of canteens swaying against hips, the creak of leather, the muffled cough of men choking on residual smoke from the bombardment. The July heat presses down on them like a weight. Over 90 degrees, every man drenched in sweat before he covers 50 yards. Pettigrew and Trimble's divisions on the left, Pickett's fresh Virginians on the right. The entire mass angling slightly leftward to converge on a small copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge, designated as the aiming point. From a distance, the formation looked less like an army and more like a shadow moving across a sunlit field, a mile-wide shadow with bayonets. A Union artillery officer watches through his glass, waits until the range tightens, gives the command. The first shells tear into the Confederate formation, not from the front. From the flanks, Union batteries on Little Round Top to the south and Cemetery Hill to the north have perfect enfilade fire, meaning they can shoot down the length of the Confederate lines rather than merely into the face of them. A shell that misses the first man in a column hits the second, or the third, or the 10th. Gaps appear in the formation. Men fall. The gaps close as soldiers step over the bodies and dress their lines without breaking stride. They keep walking. They have barely covered a quarter of the distance. The worst is still ahead. At roughly 500 yards, the gun crews switch from solid shot to case shot. Shells packed with iron balls designed to burst in the air above the advancing troops, spraying shrapnel downward in lethal cones that catch men from above where no formation can protect them. A man hears nothing before the fragment hits him. He simply drops mid-stride, as if his legs have been switched off. The man behind him steps over the body and closes the gap. At 300 yards, the guns switch to canister. Tin cans packed with musket balls that transform each cannon into a shotgun the size of a tree trunk. A single discharge at this range sweeps a lane through the Confederate line 30 yards wide. Every man in that lane goes down, dead, wounded, or knocked flat by the concussion. The gap that opens is visible from both ridges like a bite taken from a loaf of bread. A single Union gun crew works behind the wall with the mechanical rhythm of men performing a task they have done so many times that thinking about it would slow them down. The loader rams canister home. The gunner sights along the barrel at a mass of men 200 yards away, so dense that aiming is a formality. He pulls the lanyard. The cannon bucks backward. A fan-shaped blast of lead sprays across the Confederate front, and when the smoke clears a gap 30 yards wide has opened in the formation. 30 yards of empty space where men were standing 1 second ago. Every 15 seconds, another discharge. Every discharge, another gap. The ground between the ridges is no longer a farm field. It is a carpet of bodies, discarded equipment, and men writhing in agony, screaming for water. The men still on their feet step over their fallen comrades without looking down, because looking down means stopping, and stopping means dying. The Emmitsburg Road runs between the two ridges bordered by sturdy post and rail fences built by farmers for livestock. These fences, solid enough to hold a bull, now hold 12,000 men in the most dangerous 30 seconds of their lives. The first fence stops the formation cold. Men who have been walking at a measured pace under artillery fire for 15 minutes now have to stop, grab wooden rails, and climb. A soldier climbing a fence is a soldier standing still. A soldier standing still in the open at 300 yards from massed artillery is a soldier who is about to die. They bunch at the obstacle. Entire companies compress into clusters at the points where the rails are lowest or already broken by shell fire. The gunners on Cemetery Ridge watch these clusters form through their sights. They aim for the fences the way a hunter aims for a water hole. Shells burst among the packed men. Fence rails splinter into wooden shrapnel that tears through the bodies pressed against them. Men fall from the top rail and are trampled by men climbing behind them. Some tear the fences apart with bare hands, ripping rails loose and throwing them aside, while bullets crack past their ears from Union infantry that has now opened fire for the first time. Between the two fences, the Emmitsburg Road itself is a sunken lane, lower than the ground on either side, and for a few seconds, the men who drop into it feel a surge of relief because the road surface is below the angle of direct fire. That relief lasts until they reach the second fence. The second fence is the same as the first, except now the men climbing it are 100 yards closer to the Union line, and every Union musket on Cemetery Ridge is aimed at the space above the top rail. The crossing of the Emmitsburg Road takes perhaps 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the attacking force loses roughly a third of its strength. The men who survive the second fence and continue forward are no longer an army. They are fragments of an army held together by nothing except the man beside them and the officers ahead of them and the knowledge that turning back means crossing those fences again under the same fire they have just survived. Entire ranks collapse. The noise becomes indescribable. Thousands of muskets firing in disciplined volleys, shells detonating, and now the rebel yell erupting from parched throats as the Confederates abandon their measured pace and break into a stumbling run toward the wall. On the left wing, Pettigrew and Trimble's divisions are disintegrating. These men had already fought on July 1st, already bled, already lost their best officers and their strongest companies. They were not fresh. They were bandaged and exhausted, and carrying memories of fighting from 2 days earlier that had not yet settled into the part of the brain that stores things safely. Now they are walking into a converging fire that strips away formation the way wind strips leaves from a branch. One regiment wavers. Men at the back of the line slow their pace. The gap between them and the men ahead opens from 5 yards to 10 to 20. Then someone turns. Then 3 more. Then an entire company. The retreat spreads through the left wing the way a crack spreads through glass. Fast, irreversible, connected to every point of stress at once. Officers ride into the retreating mass and are shot from their saddles by Union fire that does not distinguish between men advancing and men running. The left wing collapses. Only Pickett's Virginians maintain enough cohesion to continue, but they are no longer a mile-wide assault wave. They are a spear point channeling into a narrower and narrower front, aimed directly at the angle in the stone wall. The crossing of the Emmitsburg Road has taken perhaps 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the attacking force has lost roughly a third of its strength. The survivors are within 200 yards of the wall, and what remains of Pickett's division is about to collide with the most fortified point on the entire Union line. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead places his black hat on the tip of his sword and raises it above his head so his men can see him through the smoke. He is 46 years old. His voice tears through the chaos. "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel." He leads approximately 200 men, the last coherent group in the entire assault, over the stone wall and into the Union position at the angle. For a few blood-soaked minutes, there is hand-to-hand combat inside the Union line. Confederate and Union soldiers fight with bayonets, rifle butts, rocks, fists. The fighting is at such intimate range that men are burned by the muzzle flash of muskets fired inches from their bodies. Canister rounds are discharged directly into masses of struggling men at distances measured in feet. This is the high watermark of the Confederacy, the deepest penetration of the Union line, the furthest north and east that a Confederate fighting force will ever reach. Armistead staggers forward through the melee. He reaches a Union cannon, one of the very guns that has been pouring canister into his soldiers for the last hour. He places his hand on the hot barrel. The iron is hot enough to burn skin. The barrel has been firing canister into his men for the last hour. It has killed more of his soldiers than any single weapon on the field. And he touches it, not in triumph, in something closer to recognition. The weapon that destroyed his command, the war that destroyed his friendships, the cause that demanded he walk across a mile of farmland and climb a stone wall and die beside a cannon that his closest friend had aimed at him. In that gesture, a dying general touching the weapon that ended everything he fought for, the Confederacy reaches its absolute apex and begins its irreversible fall. Armistead is struck by musket fire and crumples beside the cannon. He will linger for 2 days. In his final hours, he asks that his personal effects be sent to his old friend, Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, the man commanding the defense at the very point Armistead had just breached. They had been close friends before the war. On the night Armistead left to join the Confederacy, he had wept and told Hancock he hoped God would strike him dead if he ever raised a hand against him. Now he lay dying beside the cannon, and Hancock himself was down, shot from his horse during the breach. 2 old friends bleeding 50 feet apart, on opposite sides of a stone wall. Within minutes, Union reinforcements swarm the breach from both sides. The 200 Confederates who cross the wall are killed, wounded, or captured to a man. No second wave behind them, no cavalry striking the rear. The high water mark was not a crest of victory. It was a trap. In roughly 50 minutes, an entire division had been functionally destroyed. The survivors stagger back across fields they had crossed in parade formation less than an hour earlier. The ground they walk over is carpeted with dead and dying. Men stumble past bodies they recognize, a tent mate, a cousin, the boy from the next farm who had enlisted the same week. They step over men who are still alive and calling for help, and they do not stop, because stopping means collapsing, and collapsing means joining the carpet. On Seminary Ridge, Lee rides out on Traveler to meet the broken remnants. His face is gray. The composure that had defined him through Chancellorsville and Second Manassas, and every impossible victory that had made his name synonymous with military genius, has cracked. He reaches down from the saddle and touches the shoulders of men stumbling past. He tells every cluster of survivors the same words in a voice that officers near him said they had never heard before. "It is all my fault." He says it to men whose blood is still wet on their uniforms. He says it to men whose eyes no longer focus on anything in this world. He says it again, "It is my fault." And the men who hear it do not answer because there is nothing to say. They know whose fault it is. They have known since the first shell hit the formation at 500 yards. The next day, July 4th, in a driving rainstorm, Lee's army begins its retreat. The wagon train carrying the wounded stretches 17 miles along rutted roads. 17 miles of groaning men under gray skies. Something had broken at Gettysburg that could never be repaired. They would call it the high water mark, the angle in the stone wall where Armistead fell, the place where the tide crested and began to recede. Lee would never launch another major offensive into Northern territory. The army that had seemed invincible was permanently diminished, not just in numbers, in belief. 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln stood on this ground and delivered 272 words in approximately 2 minutes, the shortest and most powerful speech in American history. He did not describe the battle. He did not name the generals or count the dead. He reframed everything. The war was no longer a military struggle between armies. It was a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. The Gettysburg Address transformed the bloodbath into a moral reckoning that echoed far beyond the field where it was spoken. Today, over 1,300 monuments stand on this battlefield, more than on any other battlefield in the world. The most visited spot is the angle in the stone wall. A small marker shows where Armistead fell. Visitors stand where he stood, look back westward toward Seminary Ridge a mile away across gentle open fields, and try to imagine walking that distance under massed artillery fire. Most cannot, because the distance is not the problem. The problem is the silence. The field is quiet now, birds and wind and the sound of tour buses on the Emmitsburg Road. The silence makes the distance look possible. It was not. 12,000 men stepped out of a tree line and walked into that silence, and the silence killed them. It has been a graveyard for 160 years, and 1 mile of Pennsylvania farmland has never been just a field since the afternoon. A general nodded and could not say the word.